episode, I spoke to Anne Perkins about her book, Yale Needs Women. The book tells the stories of the first groups of women who went to the Ivy League universities. What we may not realize is how recent the change to coeducation was. For Yale in particular, it was in the late 1960s. Can you believe that only 50 years ago women were not allowed at most universities? In the interview with Anne, you can expect to hear about the social and political changes that the young women faced and the strength and courage they had to fight for their future. We also bring the topic to the present with what improvements still need to be made today and what organizations are doing what to help. And I hope you enjoyed the video.
Okay, I'm ready.
Is it possible for you to talk about the background of your book, the context in which women came to Yale for the first time, and a short introduction of the book?
Sure. So Yale Needs Women tells the story of the very first women who were admitted to Yale College. And most people are shocked to find that was just in 1969. So just a little over 50 years ago. Yale had been men only for 268 years before then. And then at that very edge of their history, they let the women in. Yale's not it's important to know that in the United States, Yale was not by any means the only college that banned women. Here, we let women into colleges in a big wave into the public campuses, into the historically Black colleges and universities in the 1800s and early 1900s, but sort of the top universities, Yale and Princeton and Columbia and the military academies and Georgetown and the elite colleges. Part of what they thought made them elite is they didn't let women go there. So this starts to happen in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and it happens very quickly once it starts. For the book, I wanted readers like you to not just sort of read the story as a history book, but really to experience what it was like. And so I, of all those first women that I interviewed, I picked 5 of them and really focus in on their stories. So the book is as much about the experience of Connie and Betty and Kit and Laurie and Shirley and how they experienced those first years at Yale as about the broader history too.
I was wondering what was the response to your book like? I think you just mentioned that people were shocked how recent this was.
Yeah, and my publisher sent me on a book tour around the country, and I would find coming to the book tour young women who didn't know that these colleges hadn't always been co-ed. It's not a history that colleges are proud of. They don't really mention it a lot on their websites. It's sometimes if you dig into the college history, there'll be one line and then we went co-ed, but it's kind of shameful, I think, that they kept women out for so long. So it's not a history that's widely known. I went to Yale as an undergraduate also. I arrived 8 years after these first women. No one really talked about them or the history. It was just something that wasn't talked about. I've had a great response. I've been really, really pleased. I mean, it won the Connecticut Book Award for Nonfiction in 2020. It's been listed as a best book for book groups. It's been translated into Korean and now is going to be translated into Chinese. The paperback came out this year. But you know what I like the best, and this is the first book I've ever written, have been the individual emails that I get from women or men who read the book who then they didn't necessarily go to Yale or even a place like Yale, but they have stories they want to share, or there's something about the story that resonated with them. And that's what's been most wonderful for me as a writer, is to hear those individual stories, whether it's someone pulling me aside back in the old days when I did in-person book talks after the book talk and saying something to me, or now more often writing me.
That's really wonderful. And what was the transition like? Because you mentioned that when you came 8 years later, that people didn't talk about it. So was it a very quick transition, or were there some hiccups?
Um, Hiccups, I think, would be an understatement. So Yale's intention was, um, first off, it's not like they said, "Oh my gosh, this is terrible. This is so unfair that we've let women out. We should let them in." They said, "Oh my gosh, our top candidates." Yale saw itself as producing leaders. It had produced quite a few, U.S. presidents, U.S. senators, Supreme Court justices. And those people were starting to turn Yale down, saying, I don't want to go to a men only school. I'm going to go to a school that, at least like Harvard, has a women's school, in Harvard's case, Radcliffe, nearby. Well, Yale, if you were going to date what Yale men thought of as the right kind of woman, you had to drive 2 hours. And so Yale thought, if we don't let women in, it was a marketing gimmick. We're going to keep losing candidates. And I think that cast a shadow not just over the experience of those first women, but when we continue to see inequity today, I think that's a reflection of why they let women in. So to your question, women were an extreme minority. Yale put a quota limiting their numbers, so they were just 13% of the student body. We think co-ed, we think 50-50, but that wasn't what it was like. And so many of the women had the experience that they would walk into a class and look around and would be the only woman in the class, and then would be singled out. There's one woman who said something that I've never forgotten. She said, when I raised my hand to speak in class, the guys turned to stare as if the furniture itself had offered an opinion. They were oddities. They didn't have any privacy. That many of them would write about that because they were one of the few women. People would stare at them. That many of the men felt like they were there to be the men's dates. So if you were the type of women that men thought were attractive, the phone would ring off the hook, and it would be difficult to get your studies done. You'd have to find a place where the guys wouldn't be hitting on you all the time. So that was, that's just some of what they went through. Sexual harassment and assault was something some of the women experienced as well. And a number of them had professors who didn't want women there, and who would say things like, if you're a woman in this class and you think you're going to get more than a C, you're sadly mistaken.
Okay. And for the women who did go, were they volunteering to such a harsh environment, or were they?
Yeah, well, yes. So they applied. I don't think they knew. I mean, think of it. Being 18 years old, you don't really always know what you're getting into. And so I don't think any of them really understood what it was going to be like. How could they? And then many of them were coming from, if they were in college already, there were not many choices for the brightest women in this country. So maybe they'd chosen to go to an all-women's school and they didn't like being at an all-women's school. Or maybe they'd chosen to go to, there were some good co-ed schools, but they were out in the middle of nowhere, and maybe they didn't want to be in the middle of nowhere. And places like Yale had money and unbelievable libraries and gyms and art museums. And so why wouldn't you want to go to Yale? It was thought of as the top school in the country at that time. So I think, yes, they volunteered. Yes, they felt lucky to go. Most of them will say now, even though it was hard, I'm glad I went. So, yeah.
Okay. And what kind of, you mentioned like the quota restriction of 13%. Were there other, were they allowed on sports teams or not allowed in certain subjects?
They didn't have sports teams for women. So there were, over a dozen sports teams for men, from ice hockey and fencing and sailing, football, all the ones you could think of. And for the women, they offered water ballet, gymnastics, and a dance class. And these women many of them had come from high schools where they'd been on the field hockey team, or they played on the soccer team, or played tennis. And so they got there, and what they had to do was start their own teams. I love the story of the women who started the field hockey team. And one of the things that they did is they just started writing other colleges saying Yale had a field hockey team and would they like to play a game? Yale didn't have a field hockey team other than them typing up the letter in their dorm room, you know. So they just sort of had some chutzpah and persistence and finally pushed Yale into being more equitable in terms of sports and other things.
Okay. And what has changed on women's exclusion since the time you wrote about?
Well, I would say the two things that have changed most are if you look at colleges in the United States today, the majority of undergraduates are women. So we're not seeing restrictions on the number of women in colleges. And then the other thing that's important is that when these women went to Yale, discrimination on the basis of gender was perfectly legal in the United States. There was no law preventing it. And now on colleges, we have Title IX, which says that if you discriminate against women, you're going to lose your federal funding. And even private colleges in this country are significantly dependent on federal funding. So I would say those are the two really shining things that have improved dramatically.
And what progress still needs to be made today?
I would say three areas really stand out for me. One is women in leadership positions. So if you look both at Yale and nationally at the number of women college presidents, nationally it's only 30% of college presidents. Yale has never had a woman president. There's never been one that it thought was qualified enough to be president. The same goes through in the top positions of teachers, full professors is not even a third nationally or at Yale. So those positions have still been resistant to letting women in, which is just sort of surprising, I think, still. For women of color, I said admissions is not an issue for women as a whole, but for women of color, you still see them underrepresented at colleges and in these leadership positions. Only 5% of college presidents in the United States are women of color. So they get the sort of double discrimination of race and gender. And then I think for the young women undergraduates, the sexual harassment and assault, the number still seems pretty consistent no matter which study you look at it, 1 out of 5, that's the cost in this country of being a young woman in college, is that you have a 1 out of 5 chance of being a victim of sexual violence before you leave. And that's just unacceptable. So those are the three areas I would say we really need to improve on still.
Yeah. What other things surprised you when you were researching and interviewing these women?
So I think I've mentioned the quota and why Yale admitted women. So I think I was assuming colleges were trying to do the right thing. And I think I was really disappointed and surprised that actually they weren't. And there were some really great individuals, but as a whole, the college administration did not do the right thing by the women students, and the women really had to fight for equity themselves. So that surprised me. I didn't expect to find that. I think I don't know if I was surprised. Well, yes. There hadn't been any documentation about sexual harassment and assault of women in the 1960s and 70s. And I didn't know, is that something new that's happening on campuses, or was that happening then? And so I got some training so that when I did all the interviews that I did, I would handle that question well. And it's a hard question to ask. It's uncomfortable. And I made myself ask it because the woman who helped me get training for this said, if you don't ask the question, you're saying that it's unimportant. And so I think the first time someone told me a story about being targeted for sexual assault, I thought, oh, I guess it was going on. Back then, you were as likely to have trouble with a professor saying, sleep with me and you'll get an A, don't sleep with me and you'll get a C. And then having once saying no and realizing, oh, he was serious about the C, deciding, well, I guess I'm going to have to change majors. I guess I can't be an art major. I'm going to have to be an English major. Or, knowing that there wasn't any process to hold the professor accountable and that you would probably be the one who would suffer. I think I was surprised by how often I heard those stories too.
And are there any heartwarming stories of how the women, grouped together and fought against or helped each other through those hard times?
You know, what many of them have told me is that it was a lonely time. They are friends now, particularly the women who came in as sophomores. I mean, they get together. They have I think it's even weekly, a call where they listen to music and kind of dance and talk and share things. And so, what do they call it? I think they call it a Zoom, instead of a Zoom call, they call it a Zumba call. And so I think they really have a shared identity now, but most of them will talk about then that they were just lonely and they didn't know other women, and most of their friends were men. So there's not a lot of heartwarming stories. I would say there are inspiring stories about women, and most of them are just teenagers. They're 17, 18, 19 years old, seeing what was wrong and doing everything they could to change it and to fix it. So even from Kit McClure, who decided she wanted to start an all-women's rock band, and even down to she had to get a job as a school bus driver to support herself. And when she dropped the kids off at school, she would practice her instrument in the bus until it was time to drive the kids home again. So that kind of persistence of, I'm going to do this. People don't want to let me do it. There's a lot of people my way, but I'm going to do this. That's what was really inspiring to me. And you see that in over and over again. And those are the stories that I still think about today.
Yeah. Do you think there was anything about the way it was done that had impacts on the dynamics, or,
Well, one of the things I talked to, Yale just had two people who picked who the women would be who would get to come to Yale. And these are the smartest women in the country. So you could make a cut and you still would have too many people for the slots that they did. And so what they did is they picked the women based on what we would call now grit. So they picked women who, women who had 5 brothers, or women who had been through some sort of hardship, or women who had moved, or immigrants, or had held a difficult job. And I think that was an important thing. I think Yale did it because they didn't want to look bad and have all of their first women dropping out. They wanted women who were tough, and it was easier to try to pick women who were tough than to change Yale so that you didn't have to be tough to survive there. But I think that helped. It ended up being quite a compassionate thing for the women, because there were women who could handle that really tough time, and it ended up pushing Yale harder because those women got there and they were like, this is not going to happen. We are going to change this. This is not okay the way you're running it. And that you don't have, there was only 3 women professors in the entire college. You would go through your whole Yale career as a young woman then and not have a single woman professor. Well, they wanted to change that. So I think that was an important, significant thing.
And where did you get the idea for a book? Did you speak to someone or did you read something?
So I went back to school to get my PhD, and I had a required class on the history of higher education, which I thought would have nothing to do with my research. And so I said, well, I'll just I had to write a final paper. I don't know anything about these first women who went to Yale. That's ridiculous since I went to Yale, and I'll write a paper about them. And so as a historian, where you start is the secondary literature. What have other people written about coeducation? Because Yale is such a big deal in this country. There were a number of books, and I read them, and I thought, this is amazing. They've written about coeducation, and none of them have talked to the women. and the women, so there were no, they only quoted men and looked at resources written by men. And so I lived just about 2 hours from Yale. And so I took a day off of work and I drove down to the archives at Yale because I thought, okay, these men who've written these books, maybe that's their problem. But of course, Yale's going to have great resources. And Yale had a great collection of oral histories from this time. And every single one of them, but three, was a man. They didn't have any women students. They had male students. They had, and the only women that they had were sort of the one woman administrator, the wife of one of the presidents, and a woman who was on the board of trustees. And so that made me mad. And I'm trained as a historian. I went to Yale, so I'm familiar with it. And I just thought someone's got to write this story because these women aren't going to be here much longer. I mean, when I started interviewing them, they were in their 60s. And then once I met them and started taking their oral histories, I just thought, oh, this is a great story and people need to know it. And there's so many first women in this country, whether it's a first woman firefighter or a first woman mayor or a first woman member of Congress from their district. It's a pretty universal story now, whether, you know, and so it felt like an important story to tell.
Yeah. And what did the women you interviewed think? Were they happy you were digging into this, or?
Yeah, you know, I think most of them will say they're very modest, you know, so they're not like, hey, I'm a big deal, glad you finally noticed. They're like, okay, I guess this is important and I'll talk to you and I'll tell you the story. And so they're really wonderful that way, you know, sort of modest and have done some amazing things and are funny. And I think I'm still in contact with quite a few of them. And I think they're pleased to have had their story told. Now, as a historian, I'm gonna know a lot of stuff they didn't know as college students because I'm gonna be able to get into the archives and see the letters Yale's president wrote to people and the things that this woman, Elga Wasserman, put in her file. And so I think some of them were surprised by some of the things I learned about the administration. They had perhaps thought it was, did a better job or thought a better, you know, thought better of the women than it did. But I think, you know, on the whole, they've been really pleased. One of the nice things about COVID is when I did book talks, I started saying, well, I'll just do it with some of the first women because I didn't have to travel. And so we did a bunch of book talks with me and them having a conversation. And that was super fun, way more interesting, I think, for the audience to get to meet some of these women. So that was one of the nice things about the pandemic.
Okay, and I think this will be my final question, but what are some activists and organizations doing to help with regards to this topic?
Well, I guess there's a couple areas. So the American Association of University of Women, which has been around since the late 1800s, is a great source for policy ideas, research and facts and activism on gender pay gaps and that type of thing. They're really pushing, and I would say the leaders on this women in leadership on US colleges position. On the sexual harassment of women students, there's a very good group called Know Your Nine, which is referencing Title IX. And that is led by youth and by survivors of sexual violence. And I think that's a very powerful thing in and of itself, of who they've chosen for their leadership. And they are supporting women on campuses with resources and advocacy and information. And then in terms of inequity for students of color, there are quite a few scholarship organizations. The United Negro College Fund, the Hispanic College Fund, the Asian and Pacific Islander, and so helping students have the money to go to college. And then, you know, United Negro College Fund is also emphasizing not just predominantly white places like Yale, but historically Black colleges and universities, which have been proven to have better results for students of color, the brightest students of color, all students of color, than the predominantly white schools. And so that's another strategy of saying, you know what, maybe I'm not going to go to a place like Yale. Maybe I'm going to go to a place where I'm not an extreme minority. So that's another strategy there. And then also, I would say on campuses, there are women's organizations for students of color. So people who are in a minority can find support and community. And I think that's important too.
Yeah, yes, it is important. And that was it from me. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me.
That's terrific. Thanks, Lamoni. Nice to meet you. Good work.
In the conversation we just heard, we learned about the changes that still need to be made, the organizations that are helping, as well as different problems that the women faced when they first went to Yale. What I most enjoyed was how inspiring the stories of these women were. I want to hear your thoughts on this. If you have any additional information or thoughts, please leave it in the comments down below. And thank you for watching.